Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We left off yesterday with chapter 8, verse 6. If you remember, the verse said that God tells Moshe to take the Levium. And we said that the pshat in taking the Levium, it's just a striking word. And then the following psukim say the process of how they're supposed to go about preparing the Levium for their task. But why does it say take the Levium? Let's start with Rashi. Rashi pasuk vav kachas alviim kachem b'dvarim. Take them with words, meaning convince them to step up to their role. Ashreichem shetisku leo shamashem lamakom. Rashi says a pshat like this in numerous places in Chumash, where the word take, of course, the connotation of take is to physically move someone, but many places Rashi says the meaning of take is to convince them, speak to them in a way that they feel excited and honored to have this role. Now, on the one hand, of course, that's very relatable, this pshat in Rashi. The other hand, I don't know, normally positions of prominence, positions of when it's difficult to do something, people are reluctant to do it, but when it's taking some honor, many times people are not so reluctant. It's always an interesting thing to think about. Is it so difficult to convince the Levium to play this role that they are uniquely selected for in honor for what they did? Why is it so difficult to get them to do it? What's the downside? It's not like you ask them to be a gabbai or something. I mean, that I would understand. Okay, but Orachayim on Pasuk Vav. Kachas alviim. Pirish Rashi kachim b'dvarim. V'nira. Sheniskavin Lomar Sheyavdile mi Yisrael. Laura Chaim says he thinks the pshat is we're separating the Levium from the rest of Klal Yisrael. Remember, we spoke last week that there was a separate encampment for the Levium. So there's the Mishkan in the middle, and then surrounding the Mishkan was where the Levium lived, and then in another place was where the rest of Klal Yisrael lived. The Levium are going to live by greater standards of purity than the rest of the Jewish people, because it's a very grave sin to go into the Mishkan if you're not ritually pure. And if you remember, we were discussing last week, Sukkim talking about impure people having to leave areas. There were people who weren't allowed to be among the Levium, but were allowed to be among the rest of the Jewish people, just not among the Levi camp. And so the Orach Chaim says, "V'ho'ed ma'ashagamar omer v'tiarto some." The Orach Chaim says the greatest pshat that this is correct is at the end of the pasuk. It says, so God says to Moshe, take the Levium from among Bnei Yisrael and purify them. So the Orach Chaim says, you know what he means when he says purify them? Not just purify them, but now that you're purifying them, they're going to have to be separate from everybody else. That, says the Orach Chaim, is difficult. That's a big deal. This is not just come to the Mishkan sometimes and everyone will give you this great mitzvah to do. This is, in many ways, your regular life is going to be different. So that's not so simple. So that's why kachem b'dvarim. That's why they have to be convinced for it. Interesting thing. Okay, moving on to verse 20. Okay, so there's a whole procedure detailed here. And then in verse 20 it says, Vayas Moshe v'Aaron v'chaladas b'nei Yisrael alvim. Moshe and Aaron and all of the congregation did for the Levium, k'chol asher tzivo Hashem es Moshe alvim, like everything God commanded, kein asu lahem b'nei Yisrael. So the Jewish people did for them. Okay, I get Moshe and Aaron have jobs. There's all the, you can look for yourself and what happened exactly. Why does he have to say all the congregation of Israel did for the Levium? That's not Moshe. That's not their department. That's Moshe and Aaron and the Levium's department. One question. Second question, the first part of the puzzle refers to them as Kol Adas B'nai Israel, all the congregation of the Jewish people. The second part of the puzzle refers to them as the Jewish people, B'nai Israel. Why does it shift from Kol Adas to B'nai, Kol Adas B'nai Israel to just B'nai Israel? So let's see Rashi on Pasuk Chaf. Vayas Moshe v'Aaron v'Kol Adas. Moshe Midon. Aaron Hanifam, Yisrael Samchu is a really neat thing to envision. This is difficult. This is not Rashi. This is clear in the Psukim. Literally, the Levium had to be waved, not waving to them, but literally like shake it in some way. So Moshe sort of positioned them, and Aaron did the waving of them, and the Jewish people in general, meaning representatives, of course, sort of put their hands on the Levium. That seems to be the pshat, something like that. Okay, interesting. So that's what it means. Everybody did it. Let's look at the Orach Chaim. Orach Chaim and Pasuk Chaf. Vayasv'cho das ken asu lem b'nei Yisrael. Yesh lohayer lama kafa lomar ken asu. The first part of the pasuk says Moshe, Aaron, and everybody did. The last part of the pasuk said, so the Jewish people did. It says did twice. Why? As we mentioned, why does it say at the beginning of the pasuk all the congregation of Bnei Israel? At the end of the pasuk it says Bnei Israel. V'nira, and it appears sheniskavin b'chefo kenas ulam Bnei Israel al habechoros. What it means, so the Jewish people did for them at the end of the pasuk refers specifically to the firstborn. Remember, we discussed this last week as well. Before the Levium got this special role, the role would have gone to the firstborns of various families among the different tribes. So what it means that the Jewish people did this for them refers to the firstborns that weren't Levis. There's a whole different statement being made specifically to give much credit to the firstborns. Even though they lost their spot in the service of God, they did exactly what God instructed. Hagam, kikviteva anoshi, yachiv libam, human nature would be for them to get upset. It's a painful thing, it's a hurtful thing. The normal thing would be, okay, you know what? If this is what God wants, let Moshe and Aaron and the Levium do it. I'm going to go sit in the corner. But the firstborns were as involved as everybody else in the process. And the Orach Chaim suggests that's why it's just from all the congregation of Bnei Israel to just Bnei Israel. But just Bnei Israel implies a smaller group. That just Bnei Israel at the end of it is specifically referring to the firstborn. And that separate language of so they did is specifically referring to the firstborn. That it's a great credit to them, that even though this is all about them losing an opportunity, they still were supportive and they still actively participated. There's a lot to learn from that. We're not having firstborns lose their rights today, but it happens in all kinds of ways that someone has a role, wants to have a role, doesn't work out. How do you deal with it afterwards? And there's a lot to think about. Okay, moving forward, chapter 9, verse 6. Chapter 9, verse 6. God instructs Moshe that the Jewish people should bring the Korban Pesach in the desert. This is the first time they bring the Korban Pesach after the Exodus story. And unfortunately, not everything went perfectly so, because in verse 6, there were people who were ritually impure because they had come in contact with the dead body. And they weren't able to do the Korban Pesach on that day because that's the rule, as delineated earlier in the Torah, that a person who's impure from contact with the dead body is ineligible to participate in the Korban Pesach until they purify themselves. And it's a week-long process to purify yourself. And they came from Moshe and Aaron, and they said to Moshe and Aaron, why should we lose out on this opportunity? Moshe says, let me find out what God says. And that's where the idea of Pesach Sheni comes from, where God introduces this halacha to Moshe that if a person misses out on the Korban Pesach because they were ineligible, they're able to perform the Korban Pesach a month later. Two things that jump out in verse 6. One is Vayihi. Your Hebrew grammar for a second. Vayihi means and he was. It's not and they were. The rest of the pasuk is in the plural. There were men, Asher Hayu, that they were ritually impure. It should have said Vayiyu Anashim in the plural. That's one question. Second question, imagine if we would have just said in the pasuk, there were men that were ritually impure. Now, the Torah assumes in general that you've been reading along the way and that you've been paying attention to the rules. If a person is thinking for a moment, and if they want, they can look back at the laws of Korban Pesach in the book of Shmos, but if a person is thinking for a moment, they'll know that if a person is ritually impure, they're ineligible. So why does it say there were people who were ritually impure and they weren't able to do the Korban Pesach? Yeah, I could have figured that one out actually. So those two questions: why is the first word in the singular, the rest of the pasuk in the plural, and why does that explicitly say they weren't able to do Korban Pesach? Or Achayim on pasuk vav. Vayanoshim tzarich ladas lama amar lashon yachid al harabim. Why did it start off with the singular? Va'od. Furthermore, lama hutzrach lama v'lo yachlu lasos Pesach. Why did it need to say they weren't able to perform the Pesach after it specifically said they were ritually impure? V'ulai ki litzad shetziva Hashem merosh chodesh al Pesach k'mo shepirashti b'psachim shemamer v'yasuv b'nei Yisrael as Pesach haya barosh chodesh Nisan u'min aroi haya lahem lishtamir mitoma. God tells Moshe on Rosh Chodesh Nisan that they're going to bring a Korban Pesach this year. Korban Pesach is brought on the 14th. I told you it takes a week to purify yourself. So you can say to yourself, what's wrong with these people? They knew 2 weeks ahead of time that there was a halacha. Let them be careful not to become ritually impure. V'lo chashu l'mitzvahs Pesach. They weren't going to make sure that they would be eligible for the Korban Pesach. Talmud Lomar vayihi lashon yachid. So the Ohr HaChaim says that's why the first word of the pasuk is and it was in the singular. Lomar ki lo haya ela inyan tuma echad asher nitma'u ha'anashim ba. There was only one scenario that popped up like this. In other words, it wasn't that, this was a prevailing problem. And no, there was one, and it was not on the people, but on the story. There was one story like this. There was nothing they could have done differently. And the right thing to do was to become ritually impure. He cites the famous Gemara as to why these people were impure in the first place. Some say they were they were carrying Yosef's casket. Some say they were dealing with Nadav and Avihu who had died in the Mishkan. So they needed to become ritually impure. They understood the ramifications, but you got to do what you got to do. I mean, those of us who do the wonderful mitzvah of participating in Taharas. So what do you think would happen? It's 2 days before Pesach. Person gets a call to do a Tahara. Sorry, I'm doing the Korban Pesach this year. So what? The person's not going to get buried until after Pesach? What's going to happen? You got to do what you got to do. These people had a mitzvah. So the Ohr HaChaim says, that's what it means in the pasuk. They weren't able to do the Korban Pesach, meaning, of course we know that the halacha, that if they're ritually impure, they're ineligible. They couldn't have done it any other way. They had no other option. That's why it says, I just thought that was an interesting shot in the pasuk. So we discussed this morning the Ohr HaChaim regarding why Moshe would have to convince Levium to take this role. We discussed also Rashi and Ohr HaChaim regarding why does it say that all of Bnei Yisrael participated in the certification of the Levium for the service. And then we discussed this Ohr HaChaim have to do with Pesach Sheni.